All right, let's get right into it. When you picture the Roman Empire, you probably think of legions, aqueducts, maybe some larger-than-life emperors. But underneath all of that grandeur was an engine that powered the entire civilization. And this wasn't just part of their society, it was the absolute foundation of it. We're talking about slavery.
And the scale of this, it's just staggering, almost impossible to wrap your head around. At the empire's peak, we're estimating there were 2 to 3 million enslaved people in Roman Italy alone. Think about that. That's up to 40% of the entire population. This wasn't some minor part of the economy. It was a demographic reality that shaped literally every single aspect of Roman life.
So, how do you possibly justify a system on that kind of scale? Well, you have to build a really powerful ideology. And the one they came up with was, frankly, chilling. They believed that some people were just meant to be slaves. It wasn't bad luck. It was the natural order of things, a destiny literally written into their bodies and souls from birth.
Okay, so that's the official story, the justification. But what was the day-to-day reality for the millions of people living inside this system? How did a person even become property in the first place? And what did a life of total submission actually look like? So first, we really have to get into the mechanics of it all. This wasn't just a social status, it was a business. A horrifyingly transactional business. So let's look at the grim process of how a human being was systematically turned into a piece of merchandise. The ways you could fall into slavery were, well, they were numerous and they were terrifying. Rome's constant wars of expansion, that created a steady stream of captives for the market. Pirates were always prowling the Mediterranean, just snatching people from ships or coastal towns. And, of course, if you were born to an enslaved mother, that was it. You automatically inherited her status. Even infants left to die could be picked up and raised as slaves. It wasn't one single pipeline, it was this vast, brutal, and constant supply chain.
And just like any other product, people had a price tag. These numbers, they tell a really cold story about the economics of it all. A healthy adult male, about 1,000 sesterces. Now, to put that in perspective, a poor family might live for an entire year on maybe 500. So here's the key takeaway. An enslaved person was a serious investment, a capital asset that you had to manage, protect, and exploit to get the maximum return.
And the actual process of being sold? It was completely and utterly dehumanizing. Buyers would perform an inspection that you'd normally associate with livestock. They'd poke and prod your body, check your teeth to guess your age and health, look for any scars or defects that could lower your value. It was this complete reduction of a human being to an object. Your history, your family, who you were, none of that mattered. All that mattered was your physical utility.
So once you were purchased, your life was completely defined by work. But it's a huge mistake to think this was all one single experience. The truth is, there was a massive spectrum of fates, ranging from the absolute horror of a silver mine to the gilded corridors of the emperor's palace.
Just look at these two extremes. You could be an imperial slave, a highly educated administrator, maybe managing huge sums of money. You might live in relative luxury. And get this, you could even own your own slaves called vicarii, slaves of a slave. Now, on the complete other end of the spectrum, you have the agricultural slave. Their life was just back-breaking physical labor. They could be branded and were often chained up at night in these awful prison-like barracks called ergastula. This hierarchy was crucial because it was a tool of control. It divided the enslaved population and made it harder for them to unite.
But here's the thing. It didn't matter if you were a scribe in a palace or a laborer in a field. One principle guided your master's every decision: how to squeeze the most work out of you as efficiently as possible.
This quote from an agricultural writer named Columella is so revealing. It shows this surprisingly modern, really calculated approach to management. He's saying, don't let slaves share a task. And why? So you can hold one person accountable. You can spot who's slacking off. And you can even create competition. It was basically a system of total surveillance designed to maximize output and maintain absolute control.
So this calculated approach to work, it really brings us to the psychology of the slave owner. How do they actually rationalize having this total, absolute power over another human being? It turns out it was this very weird mix of legal theory, self-serving philosophy, and just brutal pragmatism.
At the very heart of Roman law was this concept called potesta. And what it meant was that the master had absolute near-total power over the body and life of his slave. A slave had no legal rights, no personhood, nobody they could appeal to. This wasn't just a social custom, it was the bedrock of their entire legal system.
Now, to kind of soften this unbelievably harsh reality, some philosophers and masters pushed for this idea of, let's call it, benevolent paternalism. Seneca, for example, famously said you should treat your slaves with some kindness. He pointed out that their ancestors called them familia, or members of the household. It paints this comforting, almost gentle picture, right?
But then, that nice image just completely shatters when you look at the practical advice given to masters. Here, defiant slaves are basically compared to stubborn animals who just don't get reason. The only thing they respond to, the logic goes, is force. And this contradiction is everything. Slaves were part of the family, right up until they stepped out of line. Then, instantly, they were just property to be broken.
So what happens when you treat millions of people with that kind of crazy contradiction? When you call them family, but treat them like tools? Well, they don't just passively take it, they fight back. And the story of Roman slavery is also the story of constant, creative, and determined resistance.
Resistance wasn't always some big, dramatic, Spartacus-style revolt. Far more often, it was a daily war of attrition. Things like working slowly on purpose, faking an illness just to get a day of rest, accidentally breaking a tool. Stealing food wasn't just theft, it was survival. Running away was this constant thread hanging over every owner's head. And only as a last desperate resort did things escalate to open, violent rebellion.
And all of this, the little acts of sabotage, the thefts, the constant possibility of escape, it all created this deep, pervasive fear among the Roman elite. There's this famous proverb, quote servi, tot hostes. It means, as many slaves, so many enemies. And that fear is what drove the system to be so incredibly brutal.
The legal response to resistance was designed to be terrifying. There was an old custom, which later became law, that said if a master was killed by a slave, every single slave in that household could be tortured and executed, whether they were involved or not. When a city official named Pedanius Secundus was murdered, all 400 of his slaves, men, women, children, were put to death. The message could not have been clearer. Any resistance will be met with overwhelming collective punishment. The system would protect itself at any cost.
So with resistance being so incredibly dangerous, was there any hope at all? Was there a peaceful way out of this nightmare? Well, that brings us to the very complicated and often pretty cynical reality of freedom in the Roman world.
The formal process for being freed was called manumission. An owner could free a slave, and this was usually done in their will, so it would only happen after the owner died. On the surface, it sounds pretty straightforward, right? A path to freedom. But the real insight here is the massive gulf between what freedom meant to the master and what it meant to the slave. For the master, manumission was just another tool of control. It was a reward for a lifetime of loyal service, a way to look generous at your own funeral. But for the enslaved person, it was everything. The philosopher Epictetus, who was once a slave himself, said they literally prayed for it. He called slavery a state of suspended death. So freedom, that was the end of that.
And this little snippet from a real Roman it shows you exactly who got this gift. It wasn't the thousands of anonymous people toiling in the fields or dying in the mines. No, it was the trusted, skilled, high-value members of the household staff, the clerk, the estate manager, the housekeeper. Freedom wasn't a universal hope. It was a management perk, handed out to a tiny, privileged few.
So, what we're left with is this system of unbelievable scale and brutality, justified by a self-serving ideology, but always being challenged by the human desire to be free. And it really forces us to ask a tough question. How does any society, ancient or modern, rationalize building its world on the suffering of other people? And when we start looking at their answers, we might just learn something pretty uncomfortable about our own.